So this is week 2 of our 16-week online course for Child Development 100. We're going to have 2 lectures this week. This is the first one about conception, heredity, and environment. The next one will be on pregnancy and prenatal development. Some of the things that we will talk about in this lecture will be conception, just go over heredity and conception issues, just biology 101 real fast, just as a refresher. A little bit about genetics and chromosomes, and then we'll talk about the interrelatedness of our environment, our genetics, and our epigenetics. So why should we study children before they're even conceived? So this whole class is the study of children. We, as humans, develop over our entire lifespan, but we are specifically looking at what our society has deemed children. So that's before they're born all the way up until kind of 18, 19, 20 years old. So more and more studies are really showing that there's a big interrelatedness between genetics and our environment. So it's that age-old nurture versus nature argument. We're learning more and more through a lot of research studies that the environment that the child is born into matters as much as their genetic makeup. So when I'm talking about environment, I'm talking about your socioeconomic status, the family makeup, what kind of structure your family has, race, ethnicity, culture that you're being raised in, and then the languages that you might speak. And this is going to influence the child before they're born. Not specifically what the child is listening to, although that they do hear us and they do hear our voices and respond to certain people's voices more than others, but more in the fact that the pregnant woman who is carrying the child is in this environment. So her access to health care, the way that she is supported by the environment around her, the family around her, the culture around her, is going to impact that child while it's developing inside that woman. And it's probably not going to change that dramatically. So our environment can change, and we can change it throughout our lifespan, where we live, who we marry. We make lots of decisions that are going to impact our environment, but probably within those 9 to 10 months that a woman is pregnant, she's most likely not going to be making any huge changes like that. You're not suddenly going to jump from, middle class all the way to upper class, something like that. You're not going to suddenly stop speaking your home language. A lot of these things are going to remain the same, and that's the environment that the child is going to be brought home into once they are born. And we know that our heredity and our genetic makeup give us, as people and as children, physical characteristics, but some of our personality traits. So I know that I got my brown hair from my dad, I got my blue eyes from my mom, I got my lack of math skills from my mom, and I got kind of my sense of humor, which can be a little bit sarcastic sometimes, from my dad's side. So those are kind of my family physical characteristics and some of my personality traits as well. And we're actually going to be talking about that in the discussion board this week as well. So conception, I just real fast want to go over it. So we know that conception is when a sperm and an egg combine to create a zygote. And that's just a single tiny little cell which reproduces millions and millions and millions and millions of times to make the cells that make the newborn, and the newborn grows and grows and grows until they're human. So it's kind of a cool process that at fertilization we have a zygote and it becomes this person eventually. And then we have a gamete. So we have the 2 gametes, a male gamete and a female gamete, which are cells that unite. And that's how we are made. That's sexual reproduction, and that's what forms that zygote, which is the single cell that reproduces millions and millions of times. So while that is happening, we also have our DNA. And so we have 46 chromosomes. And they are in pairs, typically in pairs. And really what it is this is the genetic makeup that informs our biological characteristics. So our hair color, our eye color that I was talking about previously, and then parts of our personality and our intellect as well. It is definitely influenced by the environment around us, but some of it also comes from the genetic makeup that we inherit from our parents, and it is stored in the structure of the DNA. So with the genetic transmission, there's also dominant and recessive transmission. So you can have a dominant gene or a recessive gene. So these are examples of some of them. So for example, tongue rolling is the, you can roll your tongue up like a taco or a hot dog or something like that. So if you can do that, it's a dominant trait. And if you can't, it's a recessive trait. Then you have your earlobes, like if they're attached all the way at the bottom, your lobes are, or if they're free. Mine are free. Your pinky shape, how you fold your arms. I never knew this one until I started teaching this class. I am definitely a right over left. Cheek dimples, the cleft chin, that's kind of like the butt chin. The hitchhiker thumb, the toe length, the widow's peak. I have a very significant widow's peak, and that is from my mother's side for sure. So some of these are dominant and some of these are recessive. So I want to give you a personal example as well. So this is a very poor, I have one picture of my twins. So I have one that has a cleft chin and one that has a smooth chin. So one kind of has, like I said, the little butt chin, and the other one has a smooth chin. I don't have a cleft chin, but my husband has a cleft chin and his father has a cleft chin. One of my twins does and one of them doesn't. So cleft chin is dominant and smooth chin is recessive. So one twin got the dominant gene for the cleft chin and one twin got the recessive gene for the smooth chin. That's kind of how it works in real life. So they are fraternal twins. Obviously, they don't look anything alike. And I am going to touch a little bit on twins. It's something I'm interested in, but it actually comes into play a lot in child development because there are dizygotic twins, and those are fraternal twins, which are my sets of twins. So it's two different eggs that were fertilized by two different sperm, and they just grew up in the same womb. So they're basically sisters as far as genetic material who happen to be in the womb at the same time, and that kind of gives them their special bond, their twin bond, as if they've always been together. But they are no more genetically similar than you are to one of your non-monozygotic twins. So if you have siblings, they have the same genetic material that you do. Where more of the same genetic material comes into play is with identical twins or monozygotic twins. So monozygotic twins is one egg that's fertilized once and then it splits. So they share a lot more genetic material. So researchers want to study both sets of twins because if the identical twins are more alike in this one area that they're studying, then that shows that that trait that they're kind of studying, that heredity might come into play in that kind of situation. Because then they can look at, is it behavior, is it environment, or is it genes? Looking at twins that have a lot of genetic material in common because they were once one egg that split, or twins that don't have a lot in common because they are two different eggs. So that's kind of why we study twins. And we have kind of very specific twin studies that we do. I'm sorry, this So when my twins were born 6.5 years ago, I got a letter from UCSD within like the first 3 months of their life asking me to come down and do twin studies. So they have asked me to do social and emotional studies, or looking at like if they're on the autism spectrum. We've done perception studies to look at their eyesight and what they perceive when they were infants. And especially in that perception one with their eyesight, it was a very scientific study because they were trying to see what children can look at very young, and by studying two different types of twins, so monozygotic or dizygotic twins, they can see, is this a genetic issue or is this a behavior issue or an environment issue, and how they see and perceive things really young as infants. So that's kind of why we use twins and twin studies, is to give us more information about genetics and what kind of effect it has on us and how we grow. So if you wanted to know more about DNA, if this was an area of interest to you, there's a website called 23andMe. I don't have any connection to it at all, but they are the ones that kind of do the cheek swabs, and you can send it away. I think it is a little bit expensive, so you can find out like what percentage you are Ethiopian or Australian or Finnish or Caribbean, that type of stuff. They give you a percentage of what you are genetically if you send it away. But in order to kind of publicize this, they have some cute little videos about genetics and about our genetic traits and stuff like that. So this is an interesting website. It's the 23andMe, and they have a Gen 101 that goes over more issues in genetics. This was an area that you wanted to pursue more, and it might be, if it's something you're interested in, it in, it might also make a good topic for a research study or research paper. So now we're going to go into genetics and chromosome abnormalities. So a couple slides back, I talked about DNA, and that's where our genetic material resides. But things can happen to our genetics at the moment of conception that's going to impact our development over our lifespan as well. And in science and medicine, they're usually referred to as abnormalities or defects because the focus is really on preventing or identifying them very early on. So through genetic testing and stuff like that, they can identify if something has gone wrong genetically, or they think that it's wrong, in order to help make plans for the pregnancy or for later on after the child is born. Since I come from a social service or education point of view, we often refer to it as differences, delays, special or exceptional needs, or typical versus atypical development. And we set these up as soon as we know that there's a delay that a child is experiencing. We set up a lot of teaching and coaching parents in order to identify goals that we want to set for this child to support their early development. And how we kind of test to find out if there's genetic issues is by doing this kind of prenatal and newborn screening. So this image that I have up is all the different types of ultrasounds, blood works, and screenings that you can do in your first and second and third trimester. And I've gone through all of these. I've had 3 pregnancies. One was a miscarriage, one was a twin pregnancy, and one was for my youngest daughter, who's now 1.5. So in my last pregnancy, I knew that I was going to be delivering at Scripps Encinitas here in North County, which doesn't have a very big NICU, and that's the special part of the hospital for babies that are really sick when they're first born. And since that one had a very low-level NICU, I wanted to make sure that when my daughter came out, that we weren't going to need a better NICU or a NICU that was better to handle her needs. So I had blood work done, I had 2 ultrasounds done, and I had a bunch of screenings done, and no issues kind of presented themselves, and so I felt really comfortable delivering at a hospital that had a lower level NICU. If you did notice that maybe your screening came back at an elevated risk for Down syndrome, or you were having a hard time managing your gestational diabetes, or you thought that you were going to have a preterm birth, so before 37 weeks of gestation, you might choose to deliver it somewhere like Tri-City or Mary Birch that has a very big NICU that's been equipped to take care of children that are born needing extra care, like oxygen or feeding tubes or things like that. So this is the type of screening that we do when people are pregnant. So if you have access to health care, these types of screenings should happen so that we can screen for any kind of genetic or chromosomal disorders, so you can make a plan for your labor and delivery to make sure that a child is born as healthy as possible. So what happens if you go through one of those screenings and it notices that there is an issue with your chromosome? Down syndrome is the most easily identifiable. So out of our chromosome pairs at the 21, and that's what this picture is showing on the screen, there should just be 2 in the little circled area that says 21. There should only be 2 things of DNA, and there's 3. So that extra material actually alters the development in all domains for children with Down syndrome. We don't know what the cause is. We can identify it. There's blood tests, there's ultrasound markings that kind of look at the back of the neck. So it gives us a pretty good idea if a child might be born with Down syndrome. It's not perfect. Sometimes children aren't just born with Down syndrome, and we roll with the punches after they're born. But typically, if you know that you're carrying a child with Down syndrome, you want to make plans to have some more care during your pregnancy. Sometimes there are kidney issues or heart issues, things like that, that a special doctor, a perinatalogist, or an obstetrician needs to be in touch with so that they can monitor the child while you're pregnant, so that we know that they are developing correctly in utero while they're inside. So some of the symptoms of Down syndrome, there's typically the noticeable facial features. So if you are out in the community, you can sometimes tell if somebody has Down syndrome. This part of the body is a little bit more flattened, and they have really beautiful almond-shaped eyes as well. They also have low muscle tone. So within our muscles, if you were to feel, our calf muscles, our thigh muscles, that type of stuff, it might not be as noticeable, and they're often called floppy. So if you were just to put a newborn down on the ground, they could kind of move around. They move their arms, they can bat at things, they can move their legs, that type of thing. A child who's floppy or has low muscle tone just kind of like lays there. It's really difficult to kind of move their hands, bat their hands, that type of stuff. So they're probably going to need some physical intervention in order to help them roll over, to crawl, to walk, to run. And then we also just want to do a lot of early intervention services as well. There are typically some cognitive delays, so how you learn and process things, communication delays, things as well. So knowing and pregnancy and soon after birth allows you to get these social services as soon as possible in order to help that child reach their maximum potential over their lives. So we're going to jump right into epigenetics. So this was something that I kind of spoke about earlier in my PowerPoint slides, talking about nature versus nurture and how they all kind of work together. This is the video.
Meet Lucky Lyle and Trouble Tim. Meet Lucky Lyle and Trouble Tim. Now you might think they look a lot alike. That's because they're identical twins. But imagine them being raised in completely different environments. As adults, they turn out very differently. Lucky Lyle is a model citizen. He goes to work, pays his taxes, treats others well, and gets an education. Trouble Tim is on a different path. He robs banks, doesn't pay taxes, and gets his first prison sentence at the same time as Lyle gets his diploma. Their genes are identical, so it must be their separate environments that have made them so different, right? Well, there's more to it than that, much more. We need to rewind a bit in time. You see, one of the great questions of humanity is, what makes us us? Early explanations had a hint of the supernatural about them. As the centuries whisked by, science emerged and fought a tough battle to gain credibility. Eventually, social science emerged with the popular theory that our environment is what makes us us. Let's call this nurture. Undaunted, the biological sciences presented another theory: genes, an unchangeable blueprint in you from birth, decides everything. Let's call this one nature. So, are we a product of our genes or of our environment? The battle raged on. Observations in a newer field of study suggest that both are partly right. This field is called epigenetics. It means above genetics and has to do with how nature and nurture interact. At the heart of this discussion is one simple question asked by researcher Michael Meany: what makes a good rat mama? Well, for a rat mother, nothing says love and care like some nice, vigorous licking. The higher the number of legs, the more love and the better the mama. With this in mind, the researchers compared two groups of rat mothers, one that licked their babies a lot and another that didn't. They found that when babies grew up, they carried their mama's behavior with them and passed it on to the next generation and the next one, and so on. But could it simply be that this particular group of rats was genetically predisposed to produce caring mothers? Well, to test this, the researchers took newborn babies from low-licking mothers and fostered them with high-licking mothers, and vice versa. It turns out that if the mother is a high licker, the rat baby becomes a high licker too, regardless of whether it's genetically related to her or not. So genes really don't have anything to do with it then? In true scientific fashion, the researchers dove right into the brains of these rats to see what, if anything, was different in the brains of the babies of high-licking versus low-licking mothers. When they looked at genes that possibly play a role in motherly care, they found crucial differences. Newborn rat babies have clusters of molecules called methyl groups attached to these genes. These methyl groups silence the gene, effectively switching it off. The researchers discovered that while the methyl groups in rats from low-licking mothers were still attached, in the rats from high-licking mothers, these methyl groups had disappeared. This was also true for the rats that had been adopted by high-licking rat mothers. The care these rats received from their mothers actually physically altered their genetic expression. Now that's all fine and good for rats, but what about people? Well, the same is true for Lucky Lyle and Troubled Tim, and for you and me. The genes you're born with are the genes you've got. But lifestyle and environmental influences such as nutrition, exercise, smoking, stress, and love greatly affect your biology. These changes can actually be observed at the DNA level. The bright side is that epigenetic changes happen throughout our lives, and our choices can make real differences in how we develop as human beings.
All right, so epigenetics. So this is talking about above genetics, like he was talking about. So turning off or on our genes that determine the functions to our cells. So really what we're more interested in is less the scientific part and how our lifestyle and our environment and our early experiences change how our genetic makeup is expressed. So here's an image that talks about our diet, our social interactions, exercise, how much money we have, our exposure to chemicals like secondhand smoke, or if people around us are using and abusing drugs regularly. That type of stuff can definitely play into our genetics and how our genetic makeup is expressed. So we're very much interested in this when we're talking about kind of breaking that cycle of abuse and poverty. So by making some lifestyle changes, behavior changes, or making sure that children have exposure to early education and positive social experiences very young, we're hoping that we can make some changes when it comes to the areas of abuse and poverty. So when we're talking about genetics, though, I do just want to go back to that same thing that they're all kind of interrelated. So the puzzle pieces of who we are as an individual, as a human, all have to do with our genetics and our environment. So our parents are bringing their genetic makeup to the conception of a child. So there's the male and the female, and that's kind of the genetic makeup that we have. And so heredity plays a part into who we are and what we do. And then at conception, there might be differences already. Some things might happen with the chromosomes that set us up for different areas of potential over a bunch of different physical or intellectual domains. But then again, our genetic makeup, what we have received, can be altered by lifestyle, by environment, and by really positive early experiences. And that's something that we're going to focus on throughout this class. For some of you that want to go into education, or some of you that might want to be parents, talking about things that you can do to make sure that you are setting your child up so that they can learn and they can reach their full potential over their entire lives. All right, so this was the first part. And then there's a second part as well that has to do with pregnancy and prenatal development.